Chapter 7. Thebes Nobility's Tomb Chapels. The ancient Egyptian belief in the netherworld and the next world continued, and he continued to care for the dead and their tombs, which were the eternal home of the spirit or soul ka. These tombs were provided with funerary furniture and tools needed by the deceased owner of the tomb, which he had used, most likely, before in his first world. Of the 415 tombs of major individuals of aristocrats found on the western mainland of Thebes, to differentiate them from the tombs of the poor people who are buried in simple tombs, the majority date back to the New Kingdom. The discussion here focuses only on the inscribed tombs, that is, those in which various inscriptions and scenes have been recorded on the walls of their chapels. This is in addition to the numerous tombs that were excavated beneath the stone plateau, most likely containing the remains of members of the lower classes, such as laborers and craftsmen. It's fascinating to note that these poor burials, with their small wells, resemble the tombs of prehistoric times. The deceased's body was deposited there, arbitrarily mummified to appear as though it had dried, occasionally in a wooden casket but more frequently in a hole excavated inside the well. Following that, the grave was filled in with sand and some of the debris from the excavations, and a low projection was constructed to house a stone slab with an inscription that included the name of the deceased person and his occupation or profession. I must make it clear before we start studying the chapels of the Theban nobles' tombs that the Thebes Western Land Cemetery is made up of 6 small cemeteries named for the contemporary villages that were constructed above and between their tombs. The cemetery starts in the north with the Dra Abu el Naga Cemetery and stretches from the road that leads to the Valley of the Kings to a short distance along the road that climbs to the 2 temples of Deir el-Bahri. Then it continues west to Deir el-Bahari and the El Asasif Cemetery. Next is the cemetery known as Alwa el-Kaka, which is situated in the vicinity of the lower enclosure of the Sheikh Abd el-Kurna Cemetery, southeast of El Asasif. Next, the Sheikh Abd el-Kurna Cemetery, also known as Alwa Sheikh Abd el-Kurna, is split into 2 enclosures, the larger, upper enclosure, and the smaller, lower enclosure. The southern boundary of the cemetery is formed by the valley that faces south from the Ramesseum Temple's southern wall. Next is the Deir el-Medina Cemetery, the southernmost of the noble cemeteries of western Thebes, situated in the valley behind the hill of the Kernit Murai Cemetery. Nonetheless, the selection of sites for the tombs of the nobles was subject to certain conditions. It is noteworthy that at the start of the 18th dynasty, senior statesmen, officials, and priests, like Senefer and Rikamir, were assigned to the upper portion of the Sheikh Abd el-Kurna cemeteries downhill, while lower portion of the same downhill was reserved for less senior employees. Regarding the junior staff, we observe that they have turned the Dra Abu el-Naga area into their cemetery. As a result, we discover that the majority of the nobles' tombs, including those of ministers, high priests, provincial governors, royal priests, and the like, from the start of the 18th dynasty to the end of King Thutmose IV's reign, are gathered at the Sheikh Abd el-Kurna cemetery. It's noteworthy to note that some of the lower-level employees who already had tombs in the Sheikh Abd el-Kurna cemetery at the base of the hill dig themselves another tomb at the top of the hill after being promoted to a higher rank. For instance, when the priest Menkaperusnab became the first priest of Amun, we can observe that he excavated a new tomb for himself at the summit of the hill, which is known by his name, number 86, leaving his earlier tomb at the base of the hill, number 112. It appears that near the end of Thutmose IV's reign, the cemetery of Sheikh Abd el-Kurna was overflowing with tombs, forcing top state officials to relocate during Amenhotep III's reign. At the foot of the hill are the tombs of Amenemhat, also known as Shurur, number 48 in El-Kaka Cemetery, and Karuv, number 192 in El Asasif Cemetery, as well as the tomb of Ramos, number 55, the minister of Amenhotep III. Given that the 3 previously mentioned tombs were cut in newly discovered limestone, it appears that the artists, including painters and sculptors, were able to demonstrate their artistic abilities and talents in these new areas. This is because the earlier tombs were all distinguished by the beautiful scenes and finely detailed carvings, whether they depicted religious or worldly subjects. The Ramesside nobles selected 2 locations. The first was at the lower level of Sheikh Abd el-Kurna Cemetery, including Passeir, number 106, and Amin Moped, number 41. The second portion included the southern section of Dra Abu el-Naga Cemetery, which had tombs of Bacon Hansub, number 35, and Aminemped, number 148. The burials of the Ramesside poor were spread among most of the cemeteries, however the majority of them were located in the Dra Abu el-Naga and Deir el-Medina cemeteries. On the western mainland of Thebes, the nobles of the New Kingdom cut their tombs in the mountainside. Various religious scenes, drawings, and inscriptions were displayed on the walls of the area reserved for religious rites and rituals. In addition, they documented the historical occurrences surrounding them, such as battles and triumphs. Specifically, we see engravings or drawings of these events and situations on the tombs of the 18th dynasty nobles. The noble tomb in the New Kingdom is divided into 2 sections. Religious and worldly themes are depicted in the upper part, which is the chapel, while the mummy's burial is located in the lower part. Although the nobles' tombs vary slightly from one another in certain aspects, they all typically have a courtyard, a transverse hall, a long vestibule, and a chapel with a niche in the back wall that can hold the statue of the tomb's owner either by himself or with some family members. Every section of the tomb is situated along a single axis. We know this because the ancient Egyptians left drawings of these tombs that show a small pyramid made of mud brick on the outside of the roof, above the rock. This small pyramid dates back to King Thutmose I's reign, but it was destroyed in most of the tombs, leaving only weak archaeological remnants to suggest it. This little pyramid had a niche or gap on its facade, which is the eastern side facing the courtyard, where a statue or tiny stone stela with the name and titles of the tomb's owner, like the one in the Deir el-Medina cemetery, would have most likely been put there. Thus, the pyramid which had previously only been the right of kings and queens became the people's right. According to Anwar Shukri, it was destroyed and left no evidence of it, so it is unknown whether the entrance to the courtyard was in the form of a pylon with 2 mud brick towers, such as the Pavasa tomb number 279 in El Asasif cemetery, or whether it was a simple door surmounted by an Egyptian cornice. Carved into the mountain is the open courtyard. The tomb's walls were finished with stone or mud bricks, and in the center of the back wall was a door situated between 2 stelae with arched tops made of stone. The stelae depicted the tomb's owner sitting or worshipping in front of the offering table, receiving gifts from his family and followers. The top of the wall is topped by 2 or more rows of pottery cones that have been fixed and embedded in it on the sides of their pointed ends or heads. These cones' round or circular bases stamped and engraved with the name of the tomb's owner and some of his titles appear engraved on them. It is most likely the case that the round bases of these cones represent the ends of board planks that were used to roof houses. The well opening that leads to the burial chamber was discovered in tombs that were not connected to a funerary chamber. On the other hand, the well's mouth was frequently located in the funeral chamber if the transverse hall and long vestibule came first in the tomb. Due to the kings of Egypt's expansions beyond their borders during this dynasty, the ancient Egyptians were eager to adorn the walls of their tomb chapel at the start of the 18th dynasty with a variety of scenes, some of which closely followed ancient traditions and some of which we saw for the first time during this period. The inscriptions on the walls of these chapels appear to indicate that the nobles of this era were proud of everything that arrived in Egypt from these foreign lands. It appears that the nobles of this era were proud of everything that came to Egypt from these foreign countries, as evidenced by the records they made on the walls of these chapels. It is highly likely that the ancient Egyptians followed a particular system when cutting the tomb, designing its chapel, and then painting, engraving, and coloring its walls. Given that the work in the tomb was divided into sections, the stonemasons would start by excavating and preparing the outer courtyard. This is assuming that God extended the life of the tomb's owner to oversee it until the work was finished. Subsequently, the facade is hacked off, and the chapel's walls are polished once the transverse hall has been carved and prepared. The scenes are drawn and engraved by the engravers before being painted on the transverse hall walls by the sculptors when they start their work there. The evidence we have for this comes from what we found on the walls of this hall in the tomb of Ramos, number 55. Ramos was a minister who lived during the last years of Amenhotep III's reign and the first 5 years of Akhenaten's reign. He left his tomb in Thebes before construction was finished, possibly because he relocated to Amarna with the new king. Viewers of this tomb's chapel will see that most of the transverse hall's walls, the facade, and the outside courtyard have all been finished. It is even observed that the artists have completed the engraving and painting of a portion of the hall's walls, while work has started on the wall across from the entrance. This is demonstrated by the fact that the artists painted the scenes on the wall opposite the entrance using only ink in order to prepare it for cutting, despite the fact that some of the hall's walls still require polishing. Regarding the next room or rooms, they are not finished in terms of wall shaping or corner cutting. It is important to note that the scenes on the tombs of the Theban nobility from the 18th and 19th dynasties are either painted exclusively, in low relief, or in bas relief, with the majority of them being colored. Given that the rock at the plateau's base is clearly made up of layers, the nature of the plateau itself may be the cause of this. Because of its brittle parts, which break between the fingers of the hand, the artist was forced to use a different technique when creating the tombs than engraving. This alternative technique involves covering the walls with a thick layer of clay, topped with a layer of lime paint, and after polishing it, then drawing colored drawings on it. In order to prevent the rock from having flaws, the artist was also obliged to use mortar. Once the rock has been polished, drawing or engraving on it will be simple. When we discuss the scenes discovered within Thebes' nobles' tombs, we are referring to the ones that are displayed above ground on the walls of the burial chapels. These scenes are broken up into two portions. The first portion deals with the tomb's owner's activities and the job he completed in this life, which he wants to continue in the netherworld. The life beyond death, including aspects connected to funeral rites, was the second. The first world has a large number of scenes with various themes. Along with images referring to games, dancing, entertainment, banquets, drinking, singing, and music, there are scenes that depict the various industries that craftsmen work in and the various tasks that farmers perform in their fields. There has been an increase in the representation of flowers, flower pots, river fishing, land hunting, luxurious chariots, and well-groomed horses. Typically, the transverse hall's walls display scenes from the first world. The scene of the reigning king, under whose rule the tomb was dug, is possibly one of the most important scenes in this hall. This scene clarifies the circumstances of the tomb's owner's status. When he rises to a prominent state position or something similar, we occasionally see him depicted in front of the king. It's important to remember that the nobles' tombs are thought to be a comprehensive record that demonstrates the prosperity and advancement that accompanied ancient Egyptian civilization during this time in its history. On either side of the long vestibule that follows the transverse hall are scenes of the king who lived in his time, the owner of the tomb. The fact that the scene shows the king seated on his throne beneath his bald achin suggests that the tomb's owner has received royal approval for this representation. The scenes that represent the owner of the tomb are then seen to the right and left of each of these two scenes. Depending on his position and status, for example, we find him reviewing the products of foreign countries that dealt with ancient Egypt at the time. Next, we see scenes that represent the Syrians, Nubians, Palestinians, and Cretans. Recamir's tomb number 100. We witness representatives of these countries, each carrying presents and goods of their own. According to John Wilson, a lot of the foreign tribute scenes are ones whose truth we might question as to whether they always reflect what was forced upon them or what came about as a result of commercial relations. Undoubtedly, the ancient Egyptians aimed to spread their propaganda widely. Examples of such scenes include those in which the ruler of Tunub presents his child to the prince of Pti, the Aegean countries, the prince of the Hittites, the prince of Tunub in northern Syria, or the prince of Kadesh, all while kneeling and offering offerings, tomb of Menkaperusnub number 86. In other tombs, people from Asia, Africa, or Mediterranean inhabitants bring their country's well-known products to Egypt, leading us to believe that these people were simply trading in silver, gold, lapis lazuli, and turquoise, every precious stone and every stone of great value, and in other lesser goods. Rikamir's tomb number 100. The 18th dynasty's nobility was especially eager to paint these scenes that portrayed these people's products, and the ancient Egyptian artists were skilled at capturing these people's characteristics, their clothing, and their unique hairstyles. If the tomb owner is in the military, we can see him with his soldiers on the walls of his chapel. See military scenes in tombs NOS 78, 85, and 90. Regarding the sequences immediately to the right and left of the entry to the transverse hall, we observe the tomb's owner making a variety of offerings before finding him at a family gathering with men and women, as well as with peers and loved ones, occasionally with the accompaniment of a musical band. These scenes are frequently replaced with scenes from countryside everyday life. We see these scenes repeatedly in the tombs of people who oversaw the royal fields. Some maids give beverages to the plaintiffs, while other boys serve the men. Along with scenes of plowing the soil, there are scenes of harvesting wheat, binding its stalks into nets for transporting, winnowing, measuring the wheat. Nak tomb number 52. The tomb's entrance features a scene that is said to symbolize the tomb's owner, who is typically seen on the right side of the interior, facing eastward and greeting the rising sun. Almost the same scene may be seen on the left side of the interior, except the tomb's owner is raising his hands in salutation to the setting sun and facing westward into the tomb. We have now reached the long vestibule, which is full with scenes from funeral and burial, offerings being presented, the opening the mouth ritual, the celebration of the mummy's burial, and the hallowed journey to Abydos, the burial place of Osiris, the model figure of all righteous people who have passed away. Through scenes, paintings, and images of tombs, Adolf Ehrman describes the funeral procession. The mummy had to cross the Nile in a boat that they had adorned artistically. The coffin, which stood beneath a canopy supported by slender columns or was either placed in a large adorned box, with flowers arranged around it in the center. The women belonging to the deceased's relatives stood next to the mummy, their bare breasts exposed as they started to weep. As the funeral priest places the offerings and burns incense in front of the mummy, they weep. The boat in front of the mummy also has several women who sit on the cabin's roof and cry toward the mummy, and one of the deceased's closest relatives is standing in front of the boat and yelling at the helmsman, "Go west in order to, O praiseworthy, come in peace. If we reach the day of eternity, we shall see you again because you are traveling to the country where everyone mixes." The women of the ship weep a lot, very much, in the country of the righteous. There are male relatives aboard the third boat, while friends and colleagues make up the fourth. The boat with the coffin is placed on a sledge drawn by 4 bulls when these boats and barks carrying the servants, flowers, offerings, and funerary furniture reach the western bank, when the funeral celebration really starts. In front of the mummy, the required rites are carried out, followed by the opening the mouth ritual. As the wife gives the mummy one last embrace and wails, "I am your sister, i.e., your wife, O great one, do not leave me," these ceremonies are broken up by her heartbreaking wail. "My wonderful father, you are really gorgeous. How did I end up so far away from you? Now I go by myself. You no longer speak to me, you are no longer the talkative person that you once was." Some tombs, meanwhile, did not follow this predetermined pattern. For instance, we find in the tomb of Rikamir, number 100, that the artist finished the scenes relating to worldly life on the walls of the long vestibule, and we see them represented on the walls of the first half of the long vestibule. This is because the walls of the transverse hall were not large enough to fit all the scenes. Additionally, we find that the burial scenes, mourning women, and professional female mourners in Ramos's tomb, number 55, are located on the walls of the transverse hall to the left of the interior rather than on the ling vestibule walls, where work has not been completed. It is noteworthy that, with the exception of Senefer's tomb, number 96, and the tombs of the laborers at Deir el-Medina, the burial sections of the tombs belonging to the nobility of the 18th and 19th dynasties lack inscriptions or scenes. When we arrive at the offering chamber, a room with a niche once holding a statue, we find that the majority of its scenes are religious in nature. These scenes depict the deceased's rituals, the offerings list, and the deceased with the gods of the netherworld. Within his shrine, the deceased statue was carved into the rock, and offerings were made to it. Occasionally, he performed these rituals and rites with his wife, tombs NOS 123, 82, and 66, and other times he did so with his family, tombs NOS 343, 125, the deceased with 2 wives, 81, Inani with 4 statues, 318, and 21. Regarding the tombs with a niche reserved for the statue, it's plausible that an externally placed carved figure was positioned within. See to tombs NOS 61, 123, 92, 17, and 40. Some tombs, referred to tombs NOS 100 Recamir, 71 and 39, had false doors in front of which offerings were placed, in the lack of a niche for the statue. The false doors are currently on display in foreign international museums after being relocated from their original locations. In the offering chamber, offerings were made and, in a select few instances, rites and rituals were repeated in front of a painted or carved funeral stela located on the western wall. See to tombs NOS 260 and 249. Regarding the ornamentation found on the chapel ceilings, it was probably taken from the residences of the living because it depicts mats and occasionally takes the shape of a leather roof. This, or more precisely, the technique that was popular in the first half of the 18th dynasty, was how scenes were distributed in the chapels of the nobles' tombs. Regarding the tombs of the Ramesside era, the 19th and 20th dynasties, we observe that during this period funerary scenes took the place of scenes depicting the world of the living, i.e., scenes that depicted the tomb owner in his actions, daily life, and worldly activities, and that we used to see drawn or engraved on the walls of the transverse hall. The funeral scenes, which date to the late reign of Amenhotep III and the early reign of Akhenaten, until to the 5th year, are clearly visible to the left of the chapel's entrance, number 55. Additionally, scenes depicting the trial of the deceased also appear to have begun from this period. These can be seen in the tombs of Mena, number 69, which dates to the reign of Thutmosis IV, and Horemheb, number 78, which dates to the reigns of Thutmosis IV and Amenhotep III. The dead are seen in these scenes in front of the god Osiris. Certain deities weigh a person's heart in relation to the feather of truth, Mot, in order to determine their good and wicked activities. During this time, the scene depicting the deceased quenching his thirst in front of a sycamore tree was also added. It originated during Thutmosis IV's reign and was found in the tomb of Nakht, number 52. Just as the 19th dynasty had barely begun, the scenes depicting the worldly life were mostly replaced with religious and burial scenes from the netherworld, and the ceiling was adorned with numerous flower and bird forms. Scenes depicting the netherworld were recorded during the 20th dynasty. It should be noted that the beautiful Feast of the Valley was a once-yearly celebration held in the necropolis during the summertime harvest season, known as Shamu. The event took place in the 10th month, which is the Coptic month of Bani, which is June. One of the months in the ancient Egyptian calendar, falling on a full moon night and occurring between the flood season, Ake, or summer, and the grain planting season, Parad, or winter. The Middle Kingdom's fascination with this festival dates back to the reign of King Montuhotep-Nephitra, of the 11th dynasty, who built a tomb with a temple beneath the summit of the Holy Mountain, home to the goddess Meretseger, who loves silence, an area that was later known as Deir el-Bari. The desert valley is embraced by a range of hills to the north of the Holy Mountain's peak. The valley was well known for its veneration of Hathor, the goddess of the mountain and the sky, where her rites were performed. A shrine was erected in her honor at Queen Hatshepsut's memorial temple in Deir el-Bari. She was shown as a cow emerging from a papyrus thicket. According to what was written on the wall of the Holy of Holies, This is where the god Amun would depart in his procession from Karnak and then cross the Nile to go to his temple, which Hatshepsut had erected for him in Deir el-Bahri, and he would rest there for a night. We also know that the god Amun used to go on a Nile voyage there to see the goddess of the west, that is, to visit her at her shrines, according to a stone stela that belonged to King Amenhotep III and was discovered in a temple commemorating his memory. The holy boat, which was kept on a pedestal inside the Holy of Holies and frequently carried by the priests, is where the deity Amun sets out on his journey to the desert valley. Some of the New Kingdom's kings built shrines nearby so that the god and those accompanying him could visit and relax for a while because the processional route was lengthy and rather exhausting. This is why they were known as resting shrines or barkway stations. Similar to this, the god's boat was put on a sledge for easy pulling and dragging over the sand when it arrived in the desert. Beginning in the 19th dynasty, the boat of the ruling king was joined to the boat of the god Amun by additional boats belonging to the gods and goddesses of Karnak, including the boats of the goddess Mut, the deity Khonsu, and the goddess Amount. The massive boat known as the Amun Wizarhad was carrying the boat of Amun, the king god, across the Nile with the other boats of the gods and goddesses named above. Once it reached the western mainland, it was transported to a temple commemorating the celebrated king. Every year, the deity Amun made a visit to the necropolis, and everyone was happy to take part in this grand event that was sponsored and supervisioned by the governing king. The scenes from this major festival are clearly visible on the walls of a few temples and chapels belonging to nobles' tombs. Scenes from the tomb owner's everyday life, for instance, could be included in the festivities. It's important to note that while this is the feast of the beautiful desert valley, there are earthly scenes in the tomb that are thought to be part of this celebration. These scenes have religious significance and are meant to make the deceased happy in the netherworld because death is something that cannot be avoided. The deceased simply loses the elements and necessities of life for a little time before going on with his regular life in the netherworld. As a result, the deceased takes part in all the festivities and events, particularly in this significant yearly religious event. The goal of the ancient Egyptian celebration is to win the king's kindness and God's love in order to keep his life in the netherworld. Regarding the description of the ritual surrounding this festival, it can be found in the tomb scenes and other written works. The deity Amun, along with Mut, Amount, Khonsu, and others from the 19th dynasty, visited the necropolis to inaugurate the celebrations. Under the sponsorship of the reigning king, the procession moves to the eastern bank of the Nile and then, in the boat known as the Amun Wizarhad, crosses the river to the western bank. Previous king statues took part in the festivities as well. Various rites and rituals were performed in temples and chapels on this occasion, and offerings for the deceased were made. In addition, the king presented offerings to the gods and the necropolis inhabitants, including the deceased kings, queens, kings' mothers, priests, and the cemetery's angels, or the benevolent spirits in the cemetery. Major and minor employees participated in carrying the divine boats involved in this festival from the west bank to the location set aside for rituals.